Hello, and welcome to the inaugural Marlins Friday, we'll call it. Spring training has opened up, and there's a lot to get into. Who is gone? Who has stayed? Who are breakout candidates? And how is this Marlins season going to shake out? It was a long off season for the Marlins, and there's plenty to get into. We will get into all of it here. But firstly, I do just want to encourage everyone to like, comment, and subscribe to support what we do here at the Five Reasons Sports YouTube channel. Best coverage in South Florida sports from the Marlins, the Canes, the Heat, the Panthers, Inter Miami to the Marlins. You name it, we've got it here. And there's a lot to talk about for the Miami Marlins as pitchers and catchers reported on Wednesday. Also, keep in mind, folks, that there are a lot of Marlins who are not going to be participating, at least in the early portions of spring training, because they will be partaking in the World Baseball Classic tournament. Some notable Marlins that you will see in the World Baseball Classic: Otto Lopez, Liam Hicks, Owen Casey, obviously Sandy, and Augustine Ramirez also playing catcher for the Dominican Republic. It'll be really interesting to see how many reps he gets at catcher and what those look like for him. Obviously, his development with the glove is a big kind of overarching storyline of this season as to whether or not he will stick in that spot. But I want to get into it by starting a little bit about players that are still around, who's here and who's not. Sandy and Yuri obviously stick around. There was a little bit of that. Will they stay or will they go with the Marlins' top three in the rotation? Obviously, Sandy sticks around. Edward Cabrera is sent away to Chicago in the deal that nets the Marlins number 47 overall MLB prospect Owen Casey. He'll have the inside track to one of the three starting outfield spots in the spring that he will be competing for, but he will have plenty of competition for that spot, as the Marlins are have a lot of talent in that kind of fringy range, the 25th, 26th, 27th man on the roster. And it's going to be a really, really interesting spring training camp battle to kind of see how that plays out for the Miami Marlins. Ryan Weathers also dealt in a package for 4 prospects from the Yankees. Get some pretty solid pieces in there. You think of a guy like Dylan Jones, or Dylan Lewis. You think of a guy like Brendan Jones. 2 really high upside prospects in the Yankees system. A little bit lacking consistency to this point in their career, but you like the tools. And for a guy in Weathers who has struggled to stay healthy throughout his career, obviously the stuff is really tempting to think about next to a Sandy and a Yuri, but I think the Marlins did okay for themselves in that deal there. They do have a veteran addition to the rotation, as on Wednesday it was announced that they will be adding former Marlins draft pick in 2017, Chris Paddack. Paddack has kind of always been a guy that's been better in theory than in practice. He has a really nice changeup. The fastball's mid-90s. Throws a lot of strikes, maybe a little bit too many sometimes. Was really effective in his first year in the bigs with the Padres back in 2019, pitched to the tune of a 3.33 ERA. But since then, it's kind of bounced around the league and really hasn't found his footing. To be really honest, I was kind of hoping that the Marlins wouldn't do something like that this year. I understand what Peter Bendix is thinking when he does it. It's essentially buying prospects. You're paying $4 million to a guy for a year that you're expecting to deal at the deadline, and maybe get some prospects out of it. So you're kind of buying into your minor league system when you sign a guy like Paddack. But I would have liked to see a little bit more of an open competition with some of the younger players in the rotation. So right now, I mean, you're looking at Sandy, Yuri, and then, you've got guys like Max Meyer, you've got Braxton Garrett, you've got Adam Mazur, you've got Chris Paddock, you've got Jansen Junk. Obviously, you have Robbie Snelling and Thomas White, two guys that I hope will be given fair shots to make the rotation. I think Robbie Snelling would likely have a better chance of the two young guys to make it, considering that he did have a more robust sample size in the minors last year. And I think the Marlins are really going to want to make sure that Thomas White is kind of ready to handle a decent amount of innings at the major league level before they do make the decision to call him up. So I think that he's probably still, at the very least, a few months away. I think he's the guy that maybe you see after July this season. But overall, when you look at the additions to the roster, they add Pete Fairbanks, who was the marquee addition of the offseason. Rays closer, 75 saves over the last 3 seasons, pitched with 2.83 ERA. Really solid track record there. He'll step in and take the Marlins closer spot and kind of fill in the gap where a guy like Ronnie Henriquez and his injury kind of left a little bit of a chasm in the Marlins bullpen as far as righties with really good strikeout stuff that can just kind of be your end of game guys. Obviously, they add Owen Casey in the deal for Edward Cabrera. I do think Casey slots in as a starting outfielder from opening day onwards. I don't think you do a deal for a guy like Casey in an Edward Cabrera deal if you don't think he's your everyday starter out the gate in left field. They had Christian Morel, the power hitting corner infielder. A guy that's looking to kind of repeat what he did in 2023 when he hit 28 homers and hit about 237 with the Chicago Cubs. And if he does replicate that production, it's a solid addition. But he does feel a little bit like this year's he feels a little bit like this year's Matt Mervis just from the right side. But, an interesting flyer as a guy that has really, really plus power. And then, the Marlins also adding Esteury Ruiz from the Dodgers. A minor leaguer last year, but he does have a bit of major league experience. Could slot in as a fourth outfielder on this roster. Stole 60 plus bags a couple of years back with the Athletics. Again, a really athletic center fielder. I think the Marlins are a team right now that are a little bit lacking in speed overall, so I wouldn't be opposed to seeing Ruiz as the fourth outfielder on this ball club. But then we get into the subtractions. Cabrera and Weathers are both gone. Joey Wiemer is gone. Dane Myers is gone. And Eric Wagaman is gone. Again, for a Marlins team that was really young last year, it seems like they may be primed to get even a little bit younger with some of these subtractions and the guys that would be kind of replacing them. You think about Cabrera and Weathers and kind of what that opens the door for, whether you think of a Robbie Snelling, although I think out the gate, you're looking at probably Garrett, Junk, and Paddock as your 3, 4, 5, potentially at least. And then, Wagaman is gone. It seems like it's going to be a competition there. At first base, you have guys like Davison De Los Santos. You have guys like Griffin Conine, who the Marlins are reportedly working at first base this year. You have Heriberto Hernandez, who the Marlins are going to be giving first base reps to. So it's a lot of options for this ball club, a lot of optionality in spots where, there was speculation that the Marlins would spend a little bit more this offseason and be more aggressive as far as corner outfield bats go and corner infield bats go. But I think you look at what the team has kind of waiting in the wings, and I'm I'm okay with them wanting to sift through that before they make the decision to, hey, where are we going to allocate our resources for when this team is ready to be really good. I want to see Kemp Alderman and Griffin Conine and Owen Casey and Connor Norby and Graham Pauley and Heriberto Hernandez before deciding, hey, we need to go out and get a first baseman. We need to go out and get a third baseman. We need to go out and get a left fielder. These are things that you have to know before those kinds of decisions are made. Because the reality is the Marlins are not the Dodgers. They're not the Mets. As much as I'd like them to spend as if they were, they're a team that's going to operate with limited resources kind of no matter what. And so I understand why they want to be a little bit more selective as far as that goes. But the Marlins, one of the really interesting things with this ball club is how much competition there is at the bottom of the roster. I kind of highlighted it a little bit at the top. But I want to get into now just some of the non-roster invitees that I think are going to be really interesting to take a look at. Number one on my list, obviously you have the pitchers, right? You have Snelling, you have White. Everyone wants to see those guys. Just some of my personal favorites that I'd want to see. Kemp Alderman, last year, phenomenal season between AA and AAA. A little bit of a breakout campaign for the Marlins 2022 second round draft pick. Hit 285 with a 820 OPS, 22 homers in 130 games last year. Stole 20 bags as well between AA and AAA. The power is legit, and if the hit tool catches up to the power tool, I think he's a starting outfielder at the major league level. I think he's potentially a 25 to 30 homer guy, maybe even a little bit more. If everything kind of comes together just right for him. Obviously, you have your studs in Snelling and White, and I don't need to go too far in telling you guys how great Robbie Snelling and Thomas White were last year. Snelling 9-7, 2.51 ERA between AA and AAA. White 4-3 with a 2.31 and 21 starts from high A all the way up to AAA last year. The Marlins are also bringing in guys like Matthew Etzel, who was acquired a little bit prior to the deadline for Nick Fortes. Etzel in 36 games in the Marlins organization was solid. Hit 280 with a 757 OPS. Couple homers, 3 doubles, 2 triples. Really kind of a gap power guy, left-handed bat, hit over power, good speed, really kind of reminds you a little bit of like a diet Jacob Marcy in terms of what he does from that outfield spot. And then there's some really interesting relievers that the Marlins will get to see kind of at the major league level here. You look at guys like William Kempner, who was phenomenal in the Marlins system last year. 2.26 ERA, 67 innings pitched, 95 strikeouts, 40 walks. A little bit more of a long shot to make the roster, but overall, I think you look at that list of non-roster invitees and you see a really exciting group of guys that are going to compete in their respective positions. But I do want to get into a little bit of the position battles to watch. You're looking at third base, first base, corner outfield, and DH. Some of the guys that you're going to be looking at here are, again, Morel, Norby, Pauley, Casey, Conine, Hernandez, Davison De Los Santos, and Kemp Alderman. Guys like De Los Santos, really down a year last year, right? In the minors in AAA, really struggled for the Marlins. However, he went to the Dominican League in the winter, and he hit 309 with an 840 OPS, 5 homers in 44 games. So he's a guy that you kind of wonder if he can carry over his performance in the Winter League into, hey, this guy's going to be pretty good at the major league level. So you do hope for that because he does have really, really good power. And if the hit tool can follow along, you have a guy that can be a really, really good first baseman for a long time offensively. And then you've got Connor Norby, who was really disappointing last year. Looked like he was going to be kind of the headline piece in the Trevor Rogers trade a couple years back with how he performed in 2024. But in 2025, really struggled, dealt with some injuries. Hopefully he's healthy this year and has that opportunity to kind of take the step that he didn't really take last year. Norby, 88 games, had a 689 OPS, 8 homers. Generally not a great defensive third baseman. And that's where he's going to kind of see, some really astute competition from a guy like Graham Pauley, who kind of got hot after being called up for the second time in 2025. Had an 808 OPS, 4 homers in his final 34 games, and he's already a Gold Glove caliber third baseman. I'm not saying that I'm not predicting that Pauley wins out that battle. I think Norby still ends up your starting third baseman on opening day. But I will say if it's even close with the bat, I don't see how they don't go Pauley as their starting third baseman because he's just so good with the glove. I mean, you're talking one of the 5 best defensive third basemen in baseball right now, and would really help the Marlins have an elite defensive infield between Edwards, Otto, and himself at third base. Some other interesting players to consider there in those positions. You've got Owen Casey, who's going to be competing for a corner outfield spot. I think he's got the inside track. Casey, in 2025 was phenomenal at AAA. Hit 286 with a 937 OPS, 22 homers in 99 games. Only played in 12 major league games, hit 192. But with a sample size that small, I'm really not, putting too much weight into that performance at the big league level. He's a guy that I think has a really projectable skill set as a guy that gets on base and hits for power. And I think that, he can hit for some average. I think you're looking at a guy that at the major league level hits 280, hits 20 to 25 homers, and is just an overall solid left-handed bat, kind of somewhere in the middle of your order, whether that's 5, maybe 6 in Casey. So I think that he's going to be a really interesting player. I think that entire outfield for the Marlins this year is kind of going to be the swing factor as to whether or not, how good their offense is. Is their offense ready to be, compete for the playoffs level good? Well, that's really going to depend on Kyle Stowers, Jacob Marcy, and Owen Casey, because if those 3 guys have their best case scenario where you have Stowers replicating what he did in 25, you have Marcy replicating what he did in 25, he tailed off at the end, but still ended up, with an 842 OPS, hit 292, stole 14 bases, had 18 doubles in 55 games, played phenomenal defense in center field. If he does that again and you get what you got from Stowers last year, and then Casey kind of lives up to, his prospect billing, you've got a really solid offensive outfield. And then you've got guys at the top of the order like X and Otto, who at the very least are steady presences. And then you're hoping that guys like Augustine Ramirez can maybe improve a little bit with the hit tool. I'm still bullish on him because he didn't strike out a ton and he hit the ball really hard. And usually when those 2 things kind of come together, you have a guy that's going to become a good hitter. I think, maybe not looking to be so pull happy is something that he's going to want to work on here in 2026. But I am a believer in Augustine Ramirez going forward. Lastly, I do want to kind of touch on here a little bit of the Marlins bullpen as well, because we talked about the guys at third base and we've talked about a little bit about the guys at first base. Actually, let's go there before we move on to the pitchers. I think first base is going to be a really interesting position for the Marlins. Eric Wagaman kind of held it down last year. But you're going to really be looking at Heriberto Hernandez and Griffin Conine. Conine, to this point in his career, has been solid, really good defensive corner outfielder, but really small sample size theater, 755 OPS, 261 average in 54 major league games, big time power. The strikeout numbers haven't been as bad as what a lot of people kind of projected they would be for him. So, Conine's going to be kind of a wild card for this ball club. And then on the other end of it, you've got Heriberto Hernandez, who last year was one of your best stories overall. A guy that hit 266, had a 784 OPS, hit 10 homers in 87 games. I think he's got an inside track to, at the very least, a platoon with Griffin Conine at first base. And then your corner outfield spots, again, I think it's going to be Owen Casey. But you will see Etzel. You will see Alderman in that spot quite a bit. You'll even see a little bit of Connor Norby out in left field, from what at least some of the whispers in the offseason were. So that'll be a really interesting kind of piece for them. But, the Marlins in the field are going to be, you have your key pieces. You have your Marcy, you have your Stowers, you have Edwards and Lopez, you have Augustine Ramirez. Those guys are staples in your lineup no matter what. I think it's really figuring out how you fill that out around them, whether that's Connor Norby or Heriberto Hernandez or Owen Casey or Griffin Conine. Finding out who those other guys are going to be, or Liam Hicks even, or Javier Sanoja. I mean, there's just a lot of really good talent here that the Marlins are going to have to sift through at the end of this roster. I think, the Marlins have a lot of major league talent. I think we know that. They have guys that are capable of being on a big league roster. The task now is to find, okay, well, who are the guys that are plus major league players on this Marlins roster? And that's kind of what they're sifting through at this point, because we're all talking about guys that are largely worthy of being on big league rosters when we rattle off these names. But it's really all about finding who's going to be a real competitor for this team, or a real contributor for this team in 2026. With that being said, I want to look at a little bit here of the starting rotation. And again, it's Sandy and it's Yuri, but then who? Who are you going to be looking at here going forward? Obviously, you look at Sandy and the season that he had last year. The overall numbers don't look very good, but he was a much better pitcher in the second half. Yuri was super up and down. He was really good to start the year when he first came back, and then he kind of struggled towards the end of the season. I think he bounces back really strong. But then the Marlins are looking at guys like Garrett and Paddock and Max Meyer as their 3 through 5. I do want to just touch on Braxton Garrett a little bit, because I don't think maybe he gets enough love for as good as he's been in his Marlins career. From 2022 to 2024, he was one of your most consistent pitchers. He went 14-16 with a 3.86 ERA and 54 starts. Never really walks anybody. Has a devastating curveball that nets a lot of swing and misses. Very kind of similar to a left-handed Jansen Junk, who was really good for the Marlins in 2025. 6-4 with a 4.17 ERA and 110 innings pitched. A 3.14 fielding, independent pitching. ERA essentially. And he's going to be a really interesting pitcher to see if he can kind of build off of what he did in 2025. Because he's another guy that if he pitches really well, eventually when White, Snelling, some of these guys are ready to come up, he's going to be another guy that's in those trade conversations in order to kind of help this pipeline assembly line of prospects kind of just coming through for the Marlins and building off what they've already established as far as organizational depth. But a guy that I think is going to be an X factor is going to be Max Meyer. I think Max Meyer finishes the season in the bullpen. I think I said that last year. But I'm going to keep saying it until it's true, because I think at some point it will be. Unfortunately, I'm not sure his frame really can sustain him being a full-time starting pitcher, over the course of 170, 180 innings. Now I'd be happy to be wrong about that, because I'd like to see Max pitch well and be really successful, because he's been successful in spurts in Miami. It's just a matter of which Max Meyer you're going to get. Are you going to get the guy in March and April who, pitched to a 3.18 ERA, 47 strikeouts and 34 innings, or the guy in May and June who pitched to a 6.46 and was only able to strike out 21 in 30 innings. Now, he did allegedly have the hip injury that was bothering him for a few weeks before he had gone down. So it'll be interesting to see, if he's able to kind of reclaim some of that form that he had early in the season. Because if he is, then the Marlins do have a really solid top three. If you get the Max Meyer that you got in March and April of last year. I don't know if it's a guarantee that you get that. I don't even know if it's likely that you get that. But if you do, the Marlins do have something to look forward to at that spot in the rotation. And then obviously, you've got guys like Adam Mazur, Ryan Gusto, who I would classify as your organizational depth type of guys. Chris Paddock, who will kind of take on that Cal Quantrill role last year. Again, I don't love the Paddock move because I just don't know if you really needed to do something like that. Again, I understand the concept of, hey, if this guy pitches really well over the course of 2 or 3 months, we can flip him for something, and then we've essentially bought a couple of really good prospects. But I for a guy that just hasn't been all that good in like 6 years, I don't see it. But moving on in the rotation here, as we get to the bullpen, and this is a group that I'm probably the most bullish on, actually, out of all of the Marlins position groups. Well, the outfield, I like a lot, but I think this bullpen is going to be really good, even without Ronnie Enriquez, who was phenomenal last year. I mean, one of the better right-handed relievers in all of baseball last year. I think this is going to be a really fun group to watch in the spring and kind of beyond for the Marlins as we look at here just some of the guys that I think are going to be kind of locks in your bullpen. You've got Pete Fairbanks. You've got Anthony Bender, who was phenomenal last year. You've got Calvin Fauché, who was your starter, who was your closer last year. Not the best closer in the world, but if you're telling me he's going to be a 7th or 8th inning guy, I'm more than fine with that. Tyler Phillips, that psychopath, and I say that endearingly. Love having a guy like him in the bullpen, and he was phenomenal for the Marlins down the stretch in 2025. Lake Bacher, another solid option in the bullpen. Cade Gibson, who was a bit of a revelation coming in from the minor leagues and having a really, really strong season, pitching to the tune of a 2.63 ERA in 44 games last year. I think between Fairbanks, Bender, Fauché, Phillips, Gibson, and Bacher. That's 6 guys in the bullpen that you feel really good about. And then, that's not even including a guy like Andrew Nardi, who, if he reclaims his form that he had in 2023, you're looking at a bullpen that's 7 deep in guys that you really trust at that spot. And then you're looking at, additionally, a guy in Josh King, who they added on a 1-year, $1.5 million deal from the Cardinals. Kind of up and down throughout his career. He's been very much like a 1 good year, 1 bad year kind of guy. And he is coming off the bad year, so, maybe you get something out of him. 2.85 ERA for the Cardinals in 2023. More of that soft tossing lefty, kind of ground ball pitcher meta for John King. Does have a really high ground ball rate, which you like to see out of your relievers, especially guys that are going to be pitching in leverage. But, I don't think he's like a lock for the bullpen. I think he's likely to make it, but I don't think he's a lock by any means. And then there's some really, really good young relievers in the Marlins system that I'm really excited to see. Josh White, 5th round pick in 2022 for the Marlins. In 2025, 186 ERA over 67 innings, 107 strikeouts to 23 walks. I mean, the dude's just dominated at the minor league level. And then you've also got a guy like William Kempner, who in 2025, again, was dominant as well in 67 innings, 95 strikeouts, 40 walks, 2.26 ERA. So he's going to be, those 2 guys are going to be really interesting to kind of watch from the perspective of the bullpen and some of the younger players that you may see in the bullpen. Maybe Max Meyer even ends up in the bullpen out the gate. I think they'll try to make him a starter to begin the season, but there's no guarantees on that for him, as I don't think there really should be at this point for a guy like Max Meyer. But, the Marlins are going to have a really fun season in 2026. I don't think that they're going to be – I think this is a really high floor group, actually, for the first time in a few years. I don't see a world in which they win anything less than 72, 73 games, which I know doesn't sound super optimistic. But again, I think we're operating on a team that kind of overachieved last year in winning 78 games. But I wouldn't be surprised to see them replicate that, if not even improve a little bit on it. Because I just don't see a world in which they're like awful. I think the pitching is going to be good. I think the bullpen is going to be phenomenal this year. And I think that there's enough juice, or at least enough bodies in the field, that they can kind of sift through and cobble together a functional major league offense, kind of similar to what they did last year. They had their best offense in years in 2025. And remember, Kyle Stowers, Xavier Edwards, Otto Lopez, Connor Norby, all of these guys missed significant time. Again, you're not going into this year with, the Derek Hills of the world in your lineup, or the Eric Wagamans of the world in your lineup. And not to disparage those guys, but, you've got guys with more potential productivity and higher ceilings in those spots now. And if you even get a couple of those guys to kind of cash in, then you've got a pretty good offense at the major league level. And you have a team that could potentially compete for a playoff spot in 2026. They weren't that far behind in 2025. So if you're projecting a modest increase in wins, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to say, hey, the goal this year is get to 500, maybe even get into that final wild card spot. I think they'll be competing for it. I think they're in that tier with the Diamondbacks and not the Cardinals. I think the Cardinals are kind of rough this year. But with the Diamondbacks and I think the Brewers are kind of going to be with them this year. The Pirates are going to be much improved. The Marlins are going to be in that final wild card spot in 2026. And I'm looking forward to seeing it. I'm looking forward to seeing a lot of these younger players take that next step and seeing how the next step of this Marlins rebuild plays out. And I look forward to tracking all of that along with you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe here to support what we do at the 5 Reasons Sports YouTube channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will be seeing you next week for an actual Marlins Monday as we begin to detail these stories of the spring. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.